Let's go. Good morning, everybody. My name's Hudson Worsley, Chair of MECLA. We're joining it again for a terrific online session. Today we'll be hearing about NABERS and the Embodied Carbon tool. I'll hand over to James Elks shortly. He's Head of Product Development at NABERS. Before I do, I'd like to welcome everybody. As always, we are all on Indigenous land. I'm joining you from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and offer my respect to elders past and present and any Indigenous people at Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today for this event. Welcome everybody. Thank you for taking time out of a busy Friday, 2 short weeks in a row. I don't know if the chocolate from Easter compensates for that, but here we are at the end of that second short week. So thank you for making time. Quite a few people dived in early to this link. So James, no pressure, but the expectations are incredibly high on an informative and entertaining Friday session. Look, jokes aside, MECLA is a serious business. We just don't take ourselves too seriously. The serious side of things is we have a governance framework that makes sure we stay on the right side of public interest and the common good. We are all pre-competition. We seek to avoid conflicts of interest. If you know of any conflict that arises, please raise your hand and we'll deal with it. We all wear separate hats, multiple hats at different times, and it's quite possible that they overlap in a conflicting way from time to time. That's the nature of our work, so we keep that in mind. Meeting rules for today. We are recording the event as we try to record all events so that they become part of our library of knowledge and then are available for future reference, which is a terrific benefit for anybody to check out later. And well, I'd also like to take a couple of minutes just to give an update on MECLA, where we're at and what's coming next. For many of you have been around for quite some time. When Monica and I first put our heads around this with my colleague Ben, we were hoping for 40 organisations from around the construction ecosystem. Soon after that, Climate Kick joined us, and Kati and Alexi make up our secretariat and keep us working. But to demonstrate the momentum that this has all built, we now have over 160 members, and that's a lot of work, I'm sure you can imagine. We've really gone from an inception phase of, is there validity, is there value for this in the market, to mainstreaming it and to taking it national. I'm delighted that policy initiatives have been taken up by the South Australian government, that there's demand for us to get across West and do some more work with Western Australian industry and government, that Victorian government has done terrific work with its recommendations paper around infrastructure for the state government there, and that they're seeking alignment with the New South Wales government. The reality is, MECLA, we really plan to get as far as the end of this financial year, and asking for your membership and for membership contributions has got us this far. The end of last year, we spoke to our PCG, Project Control Group, and said, well, what's next? Should we keep going? Are we needed? The key message was, look, the L in MECLA is for leaders, and the leaders are on board and are acting. If we stop now, that momentum may fall away, and the signals to government, the signals to suppliers that, hey, this is just the start, could dissipate. We need not just the leaders, but the laggards to make this, whole of economy, whole of sector. Now, to do that, we need to keep going. And we are now going to enter the mainstreaming phase of embodied carbon as a metric. I heard Adrian Dwyer, Chief Executive of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia yesterday, talk about success metrics for a project: time, cost, quality, and carbon. If we want that fourth key metric for every major project to be the case, we want to keep going. So we'll be in touch with all of our members and seeking ongoing commitment and a new contribution to keep the fires burning, so that we can maintain our secretariat and keep MECLA happening. That's just a heads up of what's coming. We will talk further about that and proper communications, but MECLA is going to stay around. I think the value of what we're doing is evident in what we are about to hear from James, and the need for systems change. We've talked about our ecosystem, and that's what we're about, changing that ecosystem. That's probably a good segue, James, to bring you in. NABERS has engaged with MECLA membership. We've engaged a lot with you and are delighted to hear that, you know, an embodied carbon tool as part of the NABERS rating scheme that's New South Wales based, but absolutely national, and even has presence in the UK these days. It's a recognised framework. It has really successfully driven change, particularly in commercial office space, but other sectors as well. Would love to hear from you now about the tool that is being developed. I know you've got some slides and an interactive Slido, so that's terrific. And then after you've had 20 minutes to talk, let's come back and start. We'll ask questions. We'll start addressing the questions from the audience and in your Slido. James, can I hand to you?
Thank you very much, Hudson. Lovely to see everyone here. It's actually nice to have the meeting format. I feel like sometimes when we present on webinars, it just feels like kind of just shouting into the void to some extent. So as we get started, let me find my controls. I wanted to acknowledge that we're on all different parts of country today. I'm in the Blue Mountains, Darragland, and it's wet, as is all of the East Coast from what I could see on the national radar today. It's cooling down up here in the mountains, and the European trees are just starting to lose their leaves. And we saw last weekend absolute gridlock as the tourists came to visit and see that. And we've also seen the lyrebirds really start to come out recently. The lyrebirds up here are really cheeky. They like to run out in front of cars, wait for the cars to stop, and then leave again. So that's what's been happening up here in the Blue Mountains. I wanted to acknowledge to pay my respects to any Aboriginal people on the call and elders past, present and emerging. I know you've got questions, and I'm going to answer as many as I can because we've got an hour set aside for today's session, and I am not going to speak for an hour. I'm not going to speak for half an hour. I'm going to speak for like maybe 15 minutes, maybe less. And some of you have seen this before. We sort of have a no surprises policy with this project. I'm going to talk about NABERS, the standard we're developing, some of the different things today. I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail in terms of how we've developed some emissions factors, default emission factors. So if you don't know for your particular product you're using in a building what the emissions are that are coming from it, how do we develop a default for that? We're also going to talk about timelines. We could have done this project a lot faster if it was a surprise, but it wouldn't have been fit for purpose. This has been truly a collaboration between many people and organizations, and I can see lots of familiar faces on the call that have been in probably more conversations than they would have liked with me and Katie over the last couple of years. And then we'll get into questions. I've also got Katie here. So I'm head of product development at NABERS, one of the 4 areas within NABERS, and I spend a lot of time on embodied carbon. But I also, in product development, we're looking at new rating tools for operational emissions that cover all building types. We're imminently about to launch rating tools for schools, and then in the next few months also for retail stores. So there's lots of things, but the person who actually knows lots about this and runs this and does this day to day is Katie Isles, who's on the call. And so Katie's here today as well, so that, as we get into some of your sticky, crafty questions, I'll do what I can and Katie will help as well. So there's the link. You can go in and I'll put it in the chat as well, so you can just click the link if you don't want to do the steps, but you can go and put questions in. And I think the benefit of Slido is that you can kind of vote people up and we can pick the popular questions and answer those. If you don't want to do that, because often, we do lots of Miro in our team too, and I know people really hate Miro and some people really hate Slido, we'll also take some questions in the chat as well. And I might actually come to you too. So when you're putting your questions in, I might ask you to expand on that or clarify as well. So let's get into it. Now, not everybody knows about NABERS. I know lots of the faces that I can see do know, but for those who are unfamiliar, we rate the sustainability of buildings on a 6-point scale. We're Australia's largest building sustainability initiative. We're about 70 people now. In terms of the stars, For energy, for example, having 3 stars for your type of buildings means that your building is average against a similar building in terms of its size and its function. What types of buildings? This is the ever expanding list. We started with offices in 1999, and then since then, particularly in the last 4 years, we've really rapidly expanded hotels, apartments, residential aged care. And as I mentioned, we are right on the cusp, just tic-tacking at the high levels to launch a tool for private, Catholic and public schools across Australia. And also in the next few months for retail stores. So we already do shopping centres, but what about what's inside a shopping centre and strip retail and things like that? We rate on energy, water, waste, and soon, or any indoor environment quality, and soon, obviously, on embodied carbon, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And we're everywhere around Australia. So here's kind of current ratings across the CBDs. Well, it's a few weeks old now, but you get the gist. The rating lasts for 12 months. And basically, if you're in a CBD and you're looking out the window now, then you're looking at a NABERS rated building somewhere. And I think this year on track to do about 7,000 ratings. Touching briefly on this example, which I know many of you've seen before, is just how does this actually work? So Australia Square, big building in Sydney. It's got the rotating restaurant on top. And it's a premium building. It's an impressive building. But when they started rating in 2005, thinking that the building was pretty good, it turns out they got 0 stars, right? So building with lots and lots of opportunity to improve is how we kind of think about that. And that's what they did. And they went first to look at building tuning, like when's the air conditioning running? Is it running at night? Yes, it is. Okay, let's turn that off. What are the temperatures? Is the heating fighting the cooling at different times of day? Yep. Okay, let's fix that. And over a number of years, over more than a decade, they went on this journey to actually improve their energy efficiency, essentially, by just tuning the building, but also by capital upgrades. And if we look at what that meant for their energy usage, it meant that they actually reduced that by 65%. Obviously, this is a cherry-picked example, but if we look at all the buildings that NABERS rates, we see a really similar trend. Not as fast as 65%, but what this graph is showing is that on average, an average office building in our data set, an average office will reduce its energy usage by 33% over a decade, which is an exceptionally fast rate of decarbonisation. So when we take this kind of example internationally, which our director Carlos often does, people are quite shocked by this. There's not other countries that are reducing emissions in their commercial building stock at this rate, especially in existing stock, because that's really a lot of what NABERS is. This is not about building new efficient buildings, adding those into the mix and claiming it. It's about improving existing building stock to a large extent. We've also seen a similar decline of energy usage in shopping centres of 39%. We don't have 10 years of this kind of data yet to do that. And we see similar things in other sectors, but the data isn't as rigorous. So that's NABERS. That's where our strength's been for the last 20 to 25 years this year, really in operational emissions. But, over the last few years, maybe decade, as things have really sped up in terms of addressing climate change, what we know that buildings need to do is 3 things. One is to reduce their energy usage, right? They just have to be using less energy for the grid, but also because, energy is emissions. They also need to electrify, eliminate fossil fuels. So no on-site gas usage, for example, but having their buildings running all the time, fully from electricity, and that electricity being renewable energy. And then, of course, the third thing they need to do is they need to lower their embodied carbon. So when it comes to a lot of the energy stuff, you can do that year by year. And we saw that on the graphs, right? It's a journey. You go on, you tune, you upgrade, you change, you put new stuff in your building that's really efficient. But when it comes to building the building, like once the building's built, the emissions are in the sky, there's nothing you can do about it. So that is something that we really need to address upfront. And by upfront, I mean like when the architect is sketching on the pad or in the pub, or really early, all the way through as it's being built. And that's important, obviously, because buildings emit so much greenhouse gas emissions. So of energy-related emissions, it's about 40% or 38% across the globe. And so the scope here is huge for buildings to have an impact in reducing climate change. We can split that into operational and embodied carbon. At the moment, most emissions from buildings are operational. But as the grid gets greener, as it decarbonizes, what we'll see is embodied emissions, which are kind of forecast to stay similar over that period of time at the moment with no policy intervention, is that embodied carbon is going to become the biggest share. So we have to do something about it. And actually, in chatting with the Green Building Council recently, some of their updated modelling looks like right now, if you were to build a building, half of it is embodied carbon and half of it is operational emissions over its life cycle. So it is massive, and it's something that really is not being addressed except in some, some sort of out there bleeding edge developments. And I can see Joe Cutton on the line. He's doing a lot of work, for example, but across the market, embodied carbon is not being really addressed at scale. So we've been partnering with the Green Building Council of Australia over the last 2 years to develop a national standard for embodied carbon. We've spoken to everyone. We've spoken to many of you on the line, and we've spoken to people right from the people who are making the decision, this has to be a low carbon build, which is generally the people who are writing the checks, it's the people who are paying the money, right? Right through the people delivering those projects, the policymakers, and also the product manufacturers, because ultimately, unless we've got low carbon products, we're not going to have low carbon buildings. And some of you were there when I spoke to the Australian Institute of Architects earlier this year, only a couple of months, well, it's in January now. And I said, because a building's just a big stack of products, the architects didn't like that. So don't say that, note to self, when the architect's present. So what we're trying to do is do stuff urgently. And I know we've just said we've taken 2 years to do this, but that's that thing of, this is complex and needs to be a collaborative process. And we could have done it a lot faster if we just whipped something up, wrote up some rules and threw it into the world, but it would not have been very good and it may not have driven change. But we do need to do stuff fast. We can't wait to solve all the problems in embodied carbon. And if you've been working in embodied carbon at all, you know there's lots of problems to be solved in embodied carbon. We need to pick the big stuff. We need to look at the concretes and the steels and the big parts of the structure and the bigger buildings and start there and get real change happening before we start to roll that out to smaller and smaller things. And we're going to focus on doing the stuff that NABERS does really well already. So that's essentially measurement. And when we say measurement, obviously we need to measure the embodied carbon from a building, but we also mean that 2 different people can come in and measure the same building and get the same result. And right now with embodied carbon, you can't do that. You probably can, but the examples that we've seen where different LCA practitioners have done LCAs, life cycle analyses on the same building, they've come up with wildly different results in the kind of hundreds of percents different. So measurement is really important, consistent measurement. And then comparison, because one of the issues at the moment is you build a building, you measure the embodied carbon, you say, here's a number, but actually you don't know if that's good or not. Like we saw with that Dexus GPT building, they're like, oh, great, we've got a great building. They went and did the comparison, they did the NABERS rating, and they're like, oh, actually, for the kind of building that we're actually not doing that well. And so by having a tool that allows you to actually place yourself on a scale against similar buildings means you can sort of say, we've put a lot of effort in, we're not getting anywhere, what's going on? Right, well, let's fiddle and see how we can improve it. So the other thing is there's a lot going on with embodied carbon. So I know that as Alison Scotland from ASBEC presented to MECLA, probably many of you, only a couple of weeks ago, and Jeremy. So there's the ASBEC embodied carbon policy roadmap that's being developed at the moment. Like, what are all the things that we need to do to attack embodied carbon? There is the New South Wales Sustainable Building SEP, which basically means that large developments are having to disclose the quantities of materials in their buildings and soon the embodied carbon. The New South Wales Decarbonising Infrastructure Delivery Policy and Measurement Guidance, that's a mouthful. That was launched yesterday in Sydney, and that's about doing embodied carbon reductions for infrastructure. There's the New South Wales Sustainable Construction Protection of the Environment Policy by the EPA. if you notice, they're all like really long and hard to say. There's the Net Zero and Government Operations, which is about Commonwealth-owned buildings. There's the Infrastructure Australia Buildings and Infrastructure Projections, where they're looking at the forward roadmap of infrastructure, and they're actually putting some numbers on that, like what does that look like and what would a reduced amount of carbon look like in that. They don't have enough space on the slide. There's the Australian Institute of Architects Embodied Carbon Curriculum that launched this year. The Australian Institute of Quantity Surveyors are working on a standard method of measurement for embodied carbon. The Australian Buildings Code Board are considering including embodied carbon into the National Construction Code. And the Commonwealth's Net Zero Built Environment Sector Plan is also considering embodied carbon. So there's a lot on at the moment from a sort of policy and big thinking. Some of it's policy, you must do this, and some of it's more like policy in the kind of thinking way of policy. But there's a lot happening at the moment, and one of the great things is it's mostly aligned and heading in the same direction. And the benefit of that really is that, as a user or someone who might be in this ecosystem of policy and government or impacted by it, it means that ideally the requirements are going to be similar across different things. So you're not going to be having to do one thing in New South Wales and one thing in Victoria, and then one thing for the building code, and then one thing for your planning, and then, et cetera. Hopefully it's going to be something that's quite similar across all of those. So I'm just going to touch now a little bit on what is it we're going to have to do. So what does it look like to measure embodied carbon under the NABERS framework? And at the end of this, I'm going to sort of go into a bit of detail on those standard emission factors, how much carbon's coming from concrete and things like that. We're focusing on new builds and major refurbs. There's not the biggest bit of embodied emissions that is being released into the sky happens when the building is being built. Up to that point, the building is being built. The rest of the emissions through the life cycle, firstly, all based on assumptions because it's in the future, and also less, like we probably 80% is that upfront carbon and 20% depending on the building and things like that, but 20% is the rest of the life cycle, and that takes decades, right? And we're trying to solve that problem now when it comes to emissions. So we want to solve the biggest problem, the immediate problem, which is upfront carbon, and then we absolutely intend to look at the rest of the life cycle after we sort of sort that out. We're going to look at upfront carbon. So essentially that's the building materials themselves. So, you get a brick, it's taken out of the ground at some point, they shape it, they turn it into a brick, it's ready, that's the product. Then you've got to transport that to site, and then you need to crane that up into position or however you build it. So those sort of three areas, the building product, the transport, and then the actual building of the building. We are going to enable buildings to set and verify targets. Oh, yes, I do have it. And just to dive into that a little bit. So one of the most important things is allowing people really to think about this stuff up front in design. And so pretty much all of our tool, I guess, or our standard or whatever will be available freely. And we expect that, like our operational tools, it'll be embedded into people's design process. So you can set a target up front. You're like, hey, we want to have a 6-star, we're going to have an amazing building. We're going to have 80% less carbon than a similar building. We're going to have a 6-star building. And then there'll be a bunch of tools for you to actually, as you're going through design, to independently verify that. Are we actually going to get there? Or are we just making something up? Or how do we get to 6 stars? How do we reduce the embodied carbon of our building by sort of 80, 85%? Then you'll collect all your documentation as you go throughout the building process. And then at the end really is where the interaction with NABERS would be, which is where you sort of say, we put this much concrete in and this much steel in, etc. And you get a certification saying, hey, guess what? You actually did do it. You've reached a 6-star building. Well done. And then the next one, we're going to encourage using products with known emissions. And essentially what that means in the market today is an environmental product declaration or an EPD. And the reason for that is because it's not about, like, an EPD is for a particular product. So you could get an EPD for like this range of plants with bite mug, right? It's not for just any mug, an average mug, it's for that particular mug. And that's really important, because if this mug manufacturer is gone, spent lots and lots of money to decarbonize their supply chain, they need to be rewarded for that, right? So lumping them in with an average, that's not very good. And also, if this is like really bad, high carbon mug, then they're just getting pulled up to the average for free. So essentially, we want to have known emissions for a particular product, and that is kind of the gold standard. But not everything. So for example, I'm pretty sure there's no EPDs for mugs. Lots of products don't have EPDs at the moment. The big stuff does. Most steel does in Australia, most concrete does. But when you get into the smaller things, cabling, wall finishes, insulation to some extent, although they're coming, they don't have them. So we are going to need some averages. Or some defaults. So, okay, I don't have an EPD for my mugs in my building. Just to be clear, we're not going to measure mugs, but I don't have an EPD for this. What number am I going to use? So, like I said, we prefer the top of our reverse pyramid is the environmental product declaration. That's the gold standard. If you don't have that, we're going to have a space for other independently verified emission factors. And so in particular, we're looking at climate active. There are some others as well, but there will be a fallback. But then the fallback, the conservative, it will be a conservative default emission factor. And what's that looking like is actually the maximum emission factor in class. So say you pick a concrete and it doesn't have an EPD. Then we've sort of looked at what is max in class, like what is kind of some of the worst concrete you can get, and that is the number that you'll be assigned. And the reason for that is to really push people to using measured known emissions when it comes to be, to be accurate, and to really push people to measure their emissions so they can start improving them. So the way that we created these was first to look at defining the groups. So are the products performing the same function? Do we need to divide them based on their production technology? Does it match materials found in the quantities, the bills of quantities? Does it match what industry and manufacturers are producing and what they expect as the people who are producing this stuff? So this is just an example of steel. So you've got steel as a category, but then we broke that down into structural, cladding and reinforcing steel, and within structuring, hot rolled and cold rolled. So these are kind of starting to show you how we've done that across, bricks and blocks and concretes and insulations and things like that. The next thing we did is source emissions factors for each of the products in these groups. So we reviewed 2,000 Australian EPDs and 300 international EPDs, and then we kind of checked that data against a whole bunch of databases. I've got them listed: EPD Australasia, EPD International, Eco Platform, Envirodeck, IBU, Green Book, Climate Active, then some of the local LCA databases, AusLCI, Sphera, Eco Invent, and then some of the government, industry and product associations as well, like Forest and Wood Products Association and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And, like everyone has a list, and we looked at all of the lists. And we use that data as well to look at, to kind of just figure out, like, what are some of the stats that sit around these categories? Like, what is the shape of data that sits for each of these groupings? And then we did a qualitative analysis. So did we get all of the key suppliers and products that are in the Australian market? So both international products and Australian products, but the ones that are generally available here. Is there anyone missing? Is the data skewed towards a particular product or type of product within the group? Is there appropriate geographical representation particularly for imported products? And then how do the emissions factors from those EPDs that we've got now in a group, how do they compare against all the other million databases that exist, like AusLCI, for example? Because if you look at something like, I think there's one EPD for plasterboard. And if you're a manufacturer in a category and you're the first to get an EPD, odds on it's probably because you're doing something pretty right. And so if we set the conservative default at something that's really, really good, that doesn't make sense. So we had to sort of look at those different data sources to make sure we were setting it at the right level. We did lots and lots of workshops with industry throughout this process. You know, in particular, we had individual workshops, for example, over multiples for concrete, steel, facades, timber, building services. Then with building owners, constructors, specifiers, LCA practitioners. And in these workshops, we checked the data, we compared the products, we refined the groupings, we found missing emission factors, market information we weren't aware of, and the process was long and rigorous. I guess that's what I'm trying to communicate. And what we ended up with something like this, and you can see this is a screenshot from Excel, and it is the list. So it's the list of all the individual groupings, the individual products. So you can see concrete in situ less than 10 MPa, 10 to 20, 20 to 25, etc. The unit, so it's cubic meters for concrete, how certain, like how quality the data is that we have for these sources, the density, and then the gold, which is the average emission factor for that. So for concrete in situ less than 10 MPa, it's 177 kilograms per cubic meter, for example. This is not complete. I think I'm allowed to show this to you, but this is what it looks like. There's a few extra columns. There's not 50 extra columns. There's like 3 extra columns that I just cut off. It just got a bit confusing. But that is the process we've gone through, and that is nearly ready. As in, like, if you wanted it now, we could probably send it to you with some caveats, but it's nearly ready to be kind of polished and sent out into the world. The good thing about this database too, or list, I've been calling it the list, right? Because it's not very complicated. The list of emissions factors, and there's 125 different product categories or groupings on here for your information, is that there's in some of those policies I mentioned before, it's being referenced for infrastructure as well. So the idea is that, if you've got 10 MPa concrete, it's not a different average for concretes that going into an infrastructure project as opposed to a building, as opposed to a hospital, which is a building and an infrastructure project. It's the same. So the idea is this would be a standard list, and this is one of the tools that you can build into your design process. So when you're estimating up front, you could actually say, hey, what do we think concrete is? We don't know, we're not specifying it yet. Well, let's just use a default. Moving on. You can see the full scope. So just zooming out of emissions factors, and that was a bit of a whirlwind tour through them. The full scope of the standards here, we bring this up in every conversation. We spent lots and lots of time making this document really, really easy to read. Go and have a look. The standard itself is going to be those default emission factors, the methodology, like where are the edges of the building, the comparisons, the benchmarks, and then the certification tool at the end, which is, this much quantity of this much material. This year, we are going to launch this. We're going to start pilots in a few months. We were going to start them late last year. We kind of swapped the order of how that project was going to work because we realized we need to do a whole bunch of other work before we did pilots, but we were going to do pilots and then the other work. So that's part of the issue that's happened there. So if you heard me say that last year, then I apologize, but they are coming soon. We do have lots of people. If you've expressed interest in the pilots before, you're on our list. I think there's 70 people on that list at the moment. If you're not sure, just get in touch. We can go back through it. Now we can get to questions. Sorry, I spoke for longer than I intended. So I'm going to stop sharing and go to the Slido. Oh, and there's questions in. Great.
10 questions so far, James.
Great. And are they ordered in? Great. Sorry, I'm just seeing if they're ordered in terms of votes, and they are. So Ken, thank you for your question. What body will certify and verify the environmental product declaration, or this left to be industry like building certifiers? So the creation of an EPD is done by a LCA practitioner, and then it's third-party verified, and then as part of that process, and then you get it looks like it's PDF essentially, and they all look a bit different, but you get the data in a PDF. That is the EPD. You can look it up right now. If you go to EPD Australasia, you can look at their list of environmental product declarations and you can open a few and get a sense for them. Now, in terms of, we are going to have because like I said, we collected 2,500 of those and put them into a spreadsheet for it because there's no database of these things. We have that list and we are going to publish that, so that will be available. And in terms of verifying that, so for example, you've said, hey, we use this type of concrete and here's the EPD. That'll be part of our certification process to go and check that. So we'll check, what EPD did you say you use? And then do you have evidence that that type of product was actually delivered to site? I think that answers the question on that one. How often will the default emission factors be updated? It's a good question. Probably annually. Might be more often. It kind of depends on what we see in terms of the updates to new data. So essentially what we do is we take all those EPDs, we go through the process of consultation and statistical analysis and qualitative analysis. It's not a huge process, but it's not a tiny process. And so, and any EPDs are valid for 5 years. And so it depends on, in different categories will be different. So for example, I know there are a bunch of insulation EPDs that are currently in development for some of the major insulation provider or manufacturers in Australia. So, and right now I think there's very few. So maybe we do them bit by bit, or maybe we do them all at once. It's going to depend, but I imagine like annually is probably about the right amount of time to redo and look at those emission factors. Because they're shared between us and kind of infrastructure as well, we are sort of in discussions with the Commonwealth, the Australian government, about who would sort of look at these and maintain them over time, and how we would have governance over those to make sure that, they do get updated. Because that is one of the biggest complaints that we've heard at the moment, which is that, if you look at some databases, the data is out of date. And so if AusLCI, the concrete industry doesn't love the data in there. They say it's out of date. And so yes, actually making sure that it's up to date is really important to us, and we've built that into our funding. Will the target? Oh yes, Hudson, go.
Yeah, just on that, I know we're sticking to Slido, but
no, we don't have to. Yeah,
Chair's prerogative. Yesterday, several of us, including you, and I can see Anne Austin, I know you were there as well, saw the launch of the Decarbonisation Infrastructure Delivery Policy and Measurement Guidance, which you referenced in one of your slides. Part of that, there was a sneaky bullet point that I wish was massively bold, and that was the development of an emissions factor library that Transport for New South Wales is going to develop and make publicly available. We're all about collaboration. How will your emission factor library and that Transport for New South Wales emission factor library speak to one another, align? What's your thinking on that?
So the short answer is they should align. The long answer is we don't know exactly how at this time. So we've been chatting with Transport New South Wales last year about their sort of standard emission factors. And we kind of all agreed that they should be the same, but we haven't revisited that because we didn't have anything to show them at that point. So we haven't revisited that to figure out exactly how that's going to happen. But yes, unless anyone thinks differently, I absolutely agree that they should be aligned, and that's the feedback that we're providing to Transport for New South Wales.
Very much, but David's got costs involved in his library as well. So that's my understanding of it, that he calls it a cost and carbon library, but it would be excellent if they were saying the same thing. In fact, it would be quite difficult if they weren't.
Yes, agreed, Anne. Yep.
And if they're going to resource keeping it up to date, I would cheekily say, all right, we'll use your one. Thanks very much.
Yep.
Thanks. Back to Slido.
Oops, I muted myself. Will the targets be based on kilograms of CO2 EP per meter squared or rated against a reference building? The answer is neither. So, but better. So the problem with reference building is that it's tricky, and it's open. It's, what we heard from industry is that it's been open to sort of gaming. To what extent that's happening, I don't know. But you can, what is a reference building, I think, is the question. The problem with kilograms of CO2e per meter is that if you look at a warehouse versus a 60-story tower, the amount of, you're going to get a lot more carbon in that tower, really strong concrete required on lower levels of a 60-story building. And so all the warehouses are going to be great, and all the you know, tall office towers are going to be terrible, and so that's not really fair. So what we will actually do is we're collecting bills of quantity for different buildings. We're collecting different data that goes along with that, like how big is the building, where is it located, and then we're going to model that to figure out what are the things that influence embodied carbon in buildings. And, you know, is it building type by building type? Is it offices versus warehouses versus apartments? Or is it kind of like big tall buildings and small buildings and big flat buildings? You know, like, are there different categorizations that we can use? And then what are the types of things that are influencing that? So it's probably height, and it's almost certainly size, right? There's a meter squared component to it. It's probably also something to do with the soil type they're on. So, you know, if you're building in the banks of the Yarra, you're going to need big concrete footings compared to in Sydney, where you're building straight onto sandstone. And so we'll create a model that allows buildings to be compared fairly against each other. And that's kind of our special thing at NABERS, I would say, because that's what we do for operational emissions, right? When we go into a new sector, we do that. We collect all the data, we run regression analysis, and we're able to say with a reasonable amount of accuracy where a building plots against similar buildings. So that's how we're intending to do that. There is a little bit more information on how that works in the consultation paper if you want to get some more info on that. I might have a look at some of the questions in the chat now. Oh, Andrew's put that there. That's great. Oh, sorry,
James,
go Hudson.
a question there from Glenn Carlton about, he sat in on the Building Codes Board webinar yesterday, and they're giving a timeline for embodied carbon being introduced to the NCC not until 2034.
Who's saying that? Sorry, Hudson?
Glenn, the Australian Building Codes Board, the question from Glenn Carlton in the chat.
I'm scrolling.
Scrolling, it's the bottom of the chat.
Yes. In ABCB webinar. Look, I can't, you know, I'm not part of the board. I don't write the National Construction Code. That's certainly not the feedback that we've heard from industry in terms of timing or alignment. And so we'll just have to wait and see on that one. But I do that, you know, that would be sad, wouldn't it? If we have to wait till 2034 for embodied carbon to get in the building code. That would be my comment on that. Yeah.
I think we have to raise our voices on that one.
Yeah, and you know, that's a role for MECLA, as I understand it, is to, you know, make some noise. And you know, climate change is an urgent global problem that we need to solve. So waiting for literally a decade to even start measuring it or putting standards in, sad. Okay, moving on. Can I elaborate on the tier group? Yeah, Maddie, you picked that up. I didn't. So our whirlwind tour through the emission factor list, one of the things that I kind of purposefully just took out of that, because it kind of gets in a bit too much detail, is the tiers of data. So like I was saying, you know, for concrete, we've got plenty of EPDs, as you know, like 1,500 mixes or something that we put into that analysis. So it's pretty rigorous, and steel's the same. But some of the products, we don't have a lot of environmental product declarations. So it's really, there's no statistical analysis on 2 or 3 data points or 1 data point. And so in doing that, we've had to come up with tiers of data. And then depending on how good the data quality is, depends on how we treat that data. I don't want to go into more detail on that now, because I think we could easily run a workshop on just the tiering sort of system. But that is something that we are going to resolve before the tool launches. So when it comes to the list, we're going to have product, and we're going to have the average that we've seen in EPDs, and then we're going to have that conservative default I was talking about, which is kind of like the maxing class. That is the one that is really important to know the tiers for. Because, for example, if all the products in that class is like one thing and it's a really super low carbon product, then having that as the maxing class isn't very good. So we're having to apply a factor to make that maxing glass worse, and there's an interaction there with the tiers. I'll leave it at that. I probably didn't explain it very well, and I apologize, but be happy to chat to you at another time about that. Just flick me an email. Once launched, how will the tool interact with the Green Star Building's embodied carbon credit? This is something that we are working out right now with the GBCA. You know, largely that's probably not a question for me to answer, to be frank. It's probably, I should have had Jorge or Taran on the call, but essentially what we've both committed to is that it will align as much as possible, and that will be to a large extent. Like they're intending to adopt our methodology. Green Star will adopt our methodology when it is published. But exactly how that's going to work and plug in, we are meeting with them regularly to figure that one out. How do you? Oh, is sequestered carbon accounted for in this model? Yes, it is. So again, there's quite a bit in the paper on this, and typically I don't cover it because it does get a bit messy, but I'll just try and do it really quickly. So sequestered carbon, so we're going to have a way of describing your rating in essentially 3 indicators. So the first is the star rating. We've talked about the star rating, you know, which essentially just looks at the fossil carbon of your building, like the actual emissions that have gone up into the sky, not looking at sequestering or offsets or whatever. How efficiently did you build that against a similar building? How many low carbon products did you put in it as well? And that's the star rating. But we're also going to have 2 other indicators. One is an offsets indicator, which will say of all the products in your building, how many of the products you put in there have got offsets associated with them? And it'll be like a dial from 0 to 100. So 100% is all the products in there are offset and 0 is none. The next indicator is a biogenic carbon or stored carbon indicator. And the way that kind of works is that for trees grow, they suck in carbon, and the carbon is in the tree. And so we chop down the tree, we turn it into a wood product, we put the wood in a building, or timber product. We put the timber in the building, and that carbon is then in the building. So it's stored there for the life of the building. It doesn't disappear. But because we're only looking at upfront carbon, so that's kind of the negative. So, you know, your carbon's going into the air, but you're kind of sucking it in at the same time because you're storing it in the building. And often when you look at the EPD, you might have like plus 100 kilograms of CO2 that's being released into the air and like minus 500. So the maths looks really good on timber. It looks like minus 400, just making the numbers up there. But for upfront carbon, we're not looking at the whole life cycle of the building. We're not looking at what's stored in there for the life. We're just looking at till the point that it's built. And so under the international standards, we can't include that negative number. It's also slightly controversial, the negative number. There are some stories about people burying timber under their buildings to store carbon, which is obviously a bit of a weird outcome. Also, it depends on what happens at the end of life. Obviously, you burn that timber at the end of life, then the carbon goes back into the atmosphere. If you put it in landfill, some percentage goes back into the atmosphere as well. So we're not including it, but we are including an indicator. So we'll say if your building's, you know, made of 100% timber, then you'll have the little indicator saying 100%. So you've got the star rating, you'll have the offsets indicator, and you'll have the stored carbon indicator. And the reason that we separated them and didn't put them under just the star is that people want to make decisions on this stuff. So you've seen some of the architectural companies and builders at the moment who are like all competing to make the biggest timber building, and they all look absolutely amazing. And so timber is really important for them for different reasons, and they want to be recognized for it. So some of them are going to be just like, we are heading straight for like maximum on our stored carbon indicator. Don't care about the rest of it. Other people, maybe offsets are easier. We want to offset as well. And maybe other companies are like, we just want super like crazy efficient design and like low carbon products. We don't really care about timber and we don't really care about offsets. But it allows people to make that decision. And that's what we heard. Make it transparent, let us make the decision, and then the market can decide exactly what they want to prioritize. So that is where we are heading with stored carbon. Does that explain it, Hudson? Do you think it's a bit of a tricky one?
It is a tricky one. I'm also conscious of time because there are a lot of questions, and some are
I need to
getting
go faster. I hear what you're
highly
saying.
voted. Yeah, I think so. There's one in the chat about upskilling. You know, will there be any training required for people to have the skills in NABERS for this new module?
Yes, the short answer is yes. So there'll be a training course that you would need to do to become an accredited assessor under NABERS. So the kind of person who can take the quantities, take the evidence, log that into our system and generate certificates. And that would be a 1 or 2 day course, I imagine.
Okay. Back to the Slido. An anonymous question has 9 thumbs up. So let's ask that. How do you protect against the risk of innovative materials, smaller players without EPDs losing business because of the barriers to sourcing an EPD? Obviously, the cost of an EPD at the moment is prohibitive to a small operator.
Yes, and that is an issue that we've heard come up. Sorry, I missed that one. I'd scrolled down. That's tricky. So you've got some new innovative product, like geopolymer concrete, for example, and because it doesn't have any cementitious material in it, you're not part of the kind of cementitious peak bodies, so you're not covered under that either. And it's super new, and you don't want to go and spend like a whole bunch of money, maybe $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 getting an environmental product declaration. How do you get your product in market? And there's no easy answer for it, I'll say right up front. We have been advocating with the Australian government and all the states and territories around funding for this kind of thing, because there is absolutely a role to play and incentives required to help people get over that barrier of getting their product to market. So the reality is it's difficult, but when it comes to alternatives, we kind of went through a process of trying to identify what something else would be. And it's hard. Like, how do you say what the emissions are from your geopolymer concrete or your super low carbon insulation or whatever without measuring those? And the answer is you can't. And so really it's a matter of advocacy and working in terms of helping them and innovative building product manufacturers. Not a very satisfying answer, I know.
That's a thorny one, isn't it? I know ASPEC and its project, we've got Alison Scotland is a participant in this, not calling her out to answer just now, but really, I do think that's going to be an equity issue, but also overcoming a barrier to innovation, not just a social equity, but if there's a good idea, anybody who's ever been a startup or had a startup within a bigger company, getting a product over the line with a barrier of 50. Someone in the chats just said it cost them $100,000 to get an EPD for their product. The House of Bamboo, who won was co-winner of our innovative products competition last year. I can't imagine them coming up with a 50 to 100K to get their product certified, but it would make a very low carbon, fit out product. As a ecosystem, we need to work on that. I think that's going to be a problem. Other questions?
I'll try and go faster. Okay. The embodied carbon for mechanical systems, really hard. Thanks to MECLA, they arranged a tour for us to the Daikin factory, the air conditioners, and they have all the engineers were there. It was really interesting. They got a crazy number of parts, and doing an EPD for that with the literally thousands of parts within a single air conditioner is kind of, it's not impossible, but it's hard. And so what we are essentially doing for mechanical services for launch is we will have a square meter rate for mechanical services, but we're looking at ways that we can allow people who want to do a bit more calculation on their mechanical services to use something like TM65, which is a methodology for measuring the embodied carbon of mechanical services. So that's the answer when it comes to mechanical services, because they are so tricky to measure. Is there a time frame or plan for when the tool will reward embodied carbon improvements in building services? So good question, follow up. We have it on our roadmap. So as part of our proposals, one of them is a roadmap for consideration of how we expand what we're measuring, like for example, like I said, going further into the life cycles, also looking at mechanical services. So yes, it's absolutely something that needs to be addressed. To what extent we address it versus there's a market requirement to address it, like manufacturers need to address it. I don't know. A target's Jeff, yep, yours one's gone back up. That's mechanical services. A target setup early stage looks ambitious today, but not very ambitious anymore when the building is built in years later. How to address the issue? The star rating scale, like if you look at 3 stars, it's average. So you're 0 deviation from the average of your type of building. 6 stars is around 85% less carbon. Now, if we look at operational, it's taken, the average for an office is now 4.5 stars. So, and that's over 25 years. And so I don't think that from where we are today in terms of what's being put in an average building, I think we have quite a long runway in terms of buildings getting towards the 6-star rate. I'm not saying it's not an issue. I just think it's not an issue for us to have to worry about in the next few years. And so, and that's really important to us to make sure that we have that range so that people can continue to really push the envelope. But we will reach the end of that, like to some extent with NABERS for offices, like 6 stars is quite achievable now. But when NABERS launched, it was not achievable. And we're kind of expecting the same when it comes to embodied carbon. I think, if you look at an office tower right now, reducing the embodied carbon of that by 85% would be quite a challenge. Don't know if that's possible or not.
James, can I point out a question in the chat? And it's from Crystal Fleming at the Resilient Building Council. And I guess this brings me to the concept of carbon blinkers. That, yes, we're focusing on embodied carbon. Unashamedly, that's what the tool is there to look at. But when you're looking at resilience, is the tool or is the NABERS framework looking at, taking resilience into account? For instance, as Crystal asked, if a building burns down or is destroyed in a disaster, the embodied carbon that is wasted and upfront carbon, it'll be outlaid again if the same building is rebuilt. It's partly philosophical, partly practical, but how is NABERS looking at resilience as well as embodied carbon?
Yeah, there's lots in that, isn't there? When we spoke to people about what to measure, there was lots. And I think this will be the last thing that we answer because, people also circular economy, like, why don't we talk about that? Nature positivity, slavery and supply chain. Like there's so many issues to look at, but as sustainability professionals, that's our job. Like, we are talking about carbon right now. We're talking about embodied carbon. But like I said to you before, like I have a whole other job that I do that's not embodied carbon, and that is about other stuff. And it's the same for you. And we must be really clear not to be really blinkered on this kind of work. We must be making sure that we're doing all the right things in the right areas. And it is hard. But what we heard from people is that right now the biggest priority is embodied carbon. And yes, we need to expand to those. We need to do more work on that. But we need, we've got some time. I know that was a very short and probably quite unsatisfying answer, Crystal. But I think it's a good question and it's something that we should all ponder.
It's a big question. And MECLA, in our founding statement, we talk about recognizing an ecosystem, ultimately getting to circularity and the complexity, but also we're biting off the embodied carbon piece of the problem now because it's a gap. So understand one within that broader context. Look, James, we are out of time. I appreciate this is a very engaged audience and there are many questions. So you're not off the hook. We will keep talking with you. We'll keep asking you to come back and talk to us as this evolves. I'll ask, what happens to these Slido questions now? Is there a way that you could fire back bullet points to us that we can circulate to attendees so that we don't have issues hanging?
I'm going to send, I'll send the slides around. I'll send some links to our documents around, or maybe we can attach those to the email. I think quite a lot of those have been answered, or some of them haven't been answered yet, but also happy to be contacted. So if there's something that you really think we need to talk about this is important, then please reach out to me on email. Be happy to chat.
Great. Really appreciate your candor and putting your hand up saying that's a difficult question. Look, this is this is policy in development. This is a tool in development, and where there aren't concrete answers, it's because it hasn't been reached yet. So really appreciate that MECLA is part of that engagement, part of the conversation, and encourage our members to keep pushing together, keep working together. That's what we're here to do. So appreciate your time, James. Thank you, everybody, for dialing in. As we said, this has been recorded. It'll be available. James, thanks for sharing the slides. To the Secretariat, Kati and Alexi and Monica for making this happen. Thanks for getting it off the ground. Appreciate everybody's time.
Thanks for your questions.
Friday.